But I don't know what fantasy land Opening guards are living in, ladies and gentlemen. But maybe once upon a time, that case against Robert Mugabe would have held some water. Now, you are dealing with a tired old 84-year-old despot who will soon die, whose own ruling party are already squabbling just to be involved in what happens after the peaceful democratic transition to MDC rule. We're going to bring you two things from Opening opposition, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, we're going to tell you why a long war, and in particular what we think will become a civil war within Zimbabwe, will be disastrous for the people of that country, regardless of the crass assertions we hear that somehow we're technologically superior. Exactly the kind of rhetoric we heard before we went into the DRC and into Somalia and plunged those countries into long wars. Secondly, we're going to tell you about the alternatives, where we think change is coming from in Zimbabwe and where it's coming peacefully. Firstly, some rebuttal. Victor tells us sometimes sovereignty isn't absolute. We're absolutely happy to concede that, ladies and gentlemen. The case we bring you is a pragmatic one, which says that our stance makes lives better for the people of Zimbabwe. Then he tells us that power sharing has been an absolute failure. We find this strange when he lists the finance ministry as one of his shining examples of an institution Robert Mugabe has held control of, in spite of the fact that he's had a movement for democratic change finance minister, Tendai Biti, who's been able to bring inflation into single digits, who started paying civil servants $250 a month, who started to problematise ZANU control over those ministries. Then he tells us everything else has failed. No thanks, guys. Firstly, we say, on mediation, we acknowledge that sometimes mediation in these contexts takes time. We think Jacob Zuma, a very different figure in the context of the African liberation movement from Thabo Mbeki, despite its whole greater sway in Zimbabwe, and hasn't yet had long enough to mediate for them to can mediation. Secondly, they tell you sanctions hurt the people. We agree, and as we're going to bring you in our first point, this hurts them more. Lastly, two more things. He tells us now our amnesty is credible, because we back it up with the threat of force. What we tell you first is we think Robert Mugabe is quite unstable. We think he is probably a bit mental. We don't necessarily think that a man whose entire life has been built around the narrative of the strong man of Zimbabwe is likely to step down. Moreover, the very reason Lauren Gbagbo hasn't gone in to exile in the Ivory Coast at the moment is because the international community has now made amnesties virtually ineffective with African leaders by putting Charles Taylor on trial and making people believe that they're never getting an amnesty. Lastly, he tells us post-conflict dealing will be better because we'll hold elections straight away. Exactly the same mistake we made in the DRC and in Iraq. Lots of times countries are ready for elections straight away. No, let's talk about where a long war will be a disaster. Firstly, we tell you the Zimbabwean military is much stronger than they think. It has a legacy of high military spending. 24% of Zimbabwe's GDP on average over the past decade. Moreover, the recent discovery of the Monash A diamond field in the east of the country brings in $6 billion a year to the Zimbabwean military. We tell you that particularly at the point of China has an incredibly strong interest in retaining control and retaining influence in that field. It's been willing to give the Zimbabwean military, oftentimes very technologically advanced weaponry. We don't think that's going away, given the existence of the enormous numbers of diamonds in Oranga. Secondly, within this point, we tell you these soldiers are viciously loyal to Robert Mugabe. Firstly, for ideological reasons, but secondly, because they fear prosecution by the international community for massacres in Matabele land in the 1980s. We're looking at people like Constantine Chizenga, who's the current Defence Force commander. These people aren't going to give up without a fight. Lastly, we tell you they're not well trained. They have a long history of repression. But now let's look at this notion that we're just going to be welcomed with open arms as liberators. Before I do, I'll take close.
It's not that the Zimbabweans aren't ready for democracy. Robert Mugabe has stolen elections from them. It's that Robert Mugabe isn't ready for democracy.
Okay, Bron, what I'm going to get to in my second point is that we think Robert Mugabe is going to be dead quite soon, and the costs of a long civil war are unlikely to be worth overthrowing a man who's about to die. But let's talk briefly about why we're not going to be greeted as liberators. Because we tell you Zimbabwe is an ethnically divided country. Mugabe's own Zezuru people, who are the same ethnic group as Emerson Mnangagwa, one of the contenders to take his place at the head of ZANU benefit strongly, no thanks madam, from the absence of democracy in that country. We think they're likely to fight back. We think this is going to descend into a civil war. No thanks. Why do we tell you this is bad? Firstly, we think it just leads to mass death. Secondly, it leads to the destruction of infrastructure. Thirdly, we think it's likely to cause regional conflict. And fourthly, as Hugh is going to tell you, we think it damages the long-term prospects for democracy. What that shows you is that even a return to ZANU-PF rules is better than a long, bloody civil war played out between international troops and within Zimbabwe itself that will kill millions of people, especially given that we don't think we're going to get a return to ZANU. Why is that? What are the alternatives? Firstly, we tell you Mugabe is about to die. He is old and he is frail. We point out that the Majuru Umnagawa power battle within ZANU to take his place at the head of that party is already going on. What does that mean? We think it means that ZANU-PF, which currently does hold the reins of power, is likely to become much weaker very soon. Both sides of that have already approached the movement for democratic change to be involved in the post-transition coalition with them. We think at the point at which ZANU starts to fragment, that it's much more likely to bring about peaceful change and allow the MDC to take power. Moreover, we tell you that even in the context of oppression they want to talk about, the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission announced that the MDC got 48% of the vote at the last Zimbabwean election. We don't think this is a regime that has such total control of its population and of its electoral system that it's going to be able to permanently resist motions for democratic change. That's exactly why ZANU had to enter into power sharing. Lastly, what we tell you is that their policy does just completely ignore the fact that the international community does have a whole range of alternatives. We think it's a lie to say that sanctions have been levelled very heavily on Zimbabwe. We think we've made the mistake, oftentimes, of not being vicious and not being tough enough in trying to bring about internal democratic change. What we tell you is now we have an astonishing moment to achieve the possibility of peaceful democratic change in Zimbabwe when faced with the harms of a long, bloody and brutal civil war. We think that's probably quite a good thing. We're very proud to oppose.